just tell me the pronouns, the preferred pronouns. That's absolutely right, yes.
You're all from HR?
What's the name? That's your big name.
Yura.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the last name?
Matsuk.
New Zealand. We're just in the name.
I'm actually waiting for Charlie. मुझे पेन दे दो। हाँ, अच्छा मैं पेन हायर करा था।
Teacher Salma, timekeeper. Would you like we take that chair next to her so one of you can sit also? Would you like me take that chair over there so you can sit?
Actually, I'm recording and I have a better angle here.
Okay.
What are your preferred pronouns? What are your preferred pronouns?
Okay, so.
Who was the one?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to round 1 of 2018 World Schools Debating Championship in Zagreb. Please turn off your mobile phones, thank you. The motion for this round reads, this House would require professional sports teams to be owned by their local communities instead of individuals or corporations. Debating this round are Team Pakistan, who are proposing, as well as Team Bangladesh, who are opposing. The adjudicators for this round are Amira Moore from Malaysia, Claire Ryan from New Zealand, Jure Matsuk from Slovenia. Each speaker has 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The end of the speech will be marked by a double knock. The first and the 7th minutes are protected from points of information and will be marked by 1 knock. The first or the second speaker of each side will deliver a 4-minute reply speech for their side. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. I now invite the first speaker of proposition.
In 1960, profit-hungry businessmen lobbied the NFL to ban community ownership of clubs, effectively locking fans out of the sport that they loved. Today, we see this same injustice budding all across the world. In the English Premier League, for instance, Chelsea was snatched up by a Russian oligarch. Similarly, the PSG, another football club in France, was taken over by the Qatari Investment Fund in 2011. We think that before fans all over the world find themselves voiceless and excluded at the whims of rich businessmen, we as Proposition want to save them. And we strongly believe that the only way to do this is our policy, which is of community-based ownership. So what does this policy really look like? We don't think it's our burden to outline a detailed policy for you, but we think that this can happen in several ways. It could be in the form of a public company, a non-profit organization, or even a subsidiary of the local government. However, in each of these cases, majority ownership and control will still lie in the hands of the local community. In addition, we'd allow sponsorships, television deals, or TV advertisements as sources of revenue for this community as well. So having explained to you what our world really looks like, let's also go on to prove to you how we win back this sport. We have 5 arguments in favor of this. Firstly, how local communities have the right to own sports teams just as they do with any other public good. Second argument, how it's unjustified for corporations to instrumentalize and commodify a community's cultural identity. 3, how community ownership improves access of sports to its fans. 4, how we better enable sports to act as a vehicle of social change. And number 5, which is an argument my second speaker will bring to you, which is that community-based clubs are more likely to cultivate local talent and consequently improve the national team. So let's move on to this first argument first. And this is an argument where we'll first talk to you about what democratic public goods are and what their purpose is. So these goods would be things like local parks or local museums or libraries. The purpose of such goods is that they promote the well-being of the community and are essential for the life of the people that live there. They're community-based, they have community-based ownership, and they're not to be subjected to private decision-making, nor should citizens have to pay private corporations in order to avail these facilities. And thus, states recognize the status quo, and it's universally understood that they're owned by the community. Why do we then think that sports falls under this category? We have 2 reasons for that. Number 1, the communal value, the communal value of these sports. What do we mean by this? We think that clubs and teams bring together entire communities into the stadiums just as parks and museums will do. And they do it even better, because your community isn't just collecting together, but it's doing so in solidarity. We think that means something for the community. More than that, even before matches, we have people meeting together in pubs in order to cheer on their team, or mourning losses afterwards, right? So we think that what this means is that there's an intimate link between the community and the team, which we absolutely can't ignore, which is something that happens in status quo with corporate ownership. Why? Sit down, sir. But the second reason, right? The second reason we believe that this should happen is because the community is one that has the greatest stake in decisions that are taken within these clubs. Taxpayer money is what's used to build the stadiums that these teams then play on. 28 out of the 32 NFL teams use billions of dollars of taxpayer money to build their own stadiums. More than that, the places that these stadiums are constructed on are public property. These people's areas, right? People are forced to relocate and move to other residences for the building of these stadiums. So sit down, sir. So what we've proven to you through this is that if the community sacrifices their money and their land for these clubs, why then should they not have any say in how decisions are taking place within these clubs as well, right? And why do we think, and why does opposition think that this right can be snatched away by corporations who really don't care? So we've proven to you by virtue of the fact that these sports teams have communal value, and more importantly, they have a drastic impact on the community, and for these two reasons, they're democratic goods and therefore should be owned by the community. Let's move on to the second argument. Here it's important to understand what culture really means to these people. Communities are perceived by their cultures, right? Other people see you on the basis of how you express your values, how you express your heritage, right? So we think that the way you express your culture is supposed to be in your hands, and you are the only person who is liable to earn any kind of profit out of it. Why do we think clubs are a part of this culture? Clubs are a part of this culture because we think that they're sit down, sir. We think they're the most public expression of your identity. They go out there, play for you on an international level. People see them and they see you as a community. Even more than that, we think that one of the key parts of any area is the name of that area, right? The way you define any region. And all of these clubs, such as Liverpool FC, which is named after the city it came from, the Boston Red Sox, named after the city. This means that they formulate a brand name on the basis of that region, on the basis of that community's culture. We think that by virtue of this association that exists between the two, we think other corporations don't have the right to profit off of it and also be able to control the narrative or control the way that these clubs represent these people's identities. We think that's absolutely unfair. But what happens in our world? In our world, we think communities are able to take back what is rightfully theirs and benefit off of a culture that is theirs to take, which is something which doesn't happen in a corporate-owned world. Let's move on to the third argument, but before that, go ahead, sir.
Will you select national teams via national referendums?
Sit down, sir. No, because the process for selecting a national team is entirely different. Even in our case scenario, we're going to hire a coach who will then select the team on the basis of performance. We're not going to have a national vote. That's not how sports works. Moving on, third line of argument, about how we increase the access to fans, and understand the importance of this argument. Here we have to contrast the motives of a rich billionaire versus the motives of a community when it comes to sport. A rich businessman will be absolutely apathetic to the needs and desires of the average fan or the average community member, because their only purpose here is profit, right? This sports team, to them, is one of the many businesses that they'll line their pockets with, but to the community, it's their one form of representation. It's their identity and their pride. That's the difference, right? Which is why we think that when it comes to decision making, these corporations will not be able to take the best decisions for these teams. And this comes in two ways, right? And how does this harm people? Firstly, in terms of ticket and merchandise pricing. So here we'll give you the example of the English League versus the German League. So the German League is one which is has community-based clubs largely, right? And the average ticket price is £14. But in the English League, where you have largely corporate-owned clubs, the starting price is £28, double that of the German League. What does that show to you? That shows to you that these fans who can't afford to go and watch these matches because of high prices are locked out of the sport that they love, cannot get to cheer on their teams. We saw an example of this when German fans protested outside English stadiums because they couldn't watch their own, or they couldn't go out there and cheer on their team because of the skyrocketing prices. We think it's absolutely unfair for corporations to keep prioritizing excessive profits over working class fans who deserve to watch their sport and their team. But in our world, what happens? Sit down, sir. In our world, we have, for instance, the way that German clubs work, we have a board of directors voted in by the community. These directors then are representatives of the community and take the best decisions for them, which is why we think that prices will go down. But secondly, other problematic decision making, right? In terms of relocation. So owners of teams often force these teams to move out of their original communities. And we've seen multiple examples of this in American sport. For instance, within the NFL, very recently, the San Diego Chargers were forced to move to LA simply on the whims of a businessman who wanted to do so for marketing. What did this result in? This resulted in fans not being able to associate with a team that had been a part of their culture for 56 years. So because we think we care about the sport and we care about the fans, and they really don't, side proposition should win this debate.
I would like to thank the first speaker of proposition for their speech, and would like to invite the first speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
If communities care about the sports that these teams participate in, they also care about the fact that these clubs need to achieve success. This is exactly why they cheer the loudest when their club wins the local league or makes it big on an international stage. We think this is also where the interests of the community and the corporations that own them intersect. As in, corporations make the biggest profits and make the biggest revenue margins, the point at which the club becomes successful in and of itself. We think that this intersection is highly important because it highlights that the community's interests and the corporation's interests are not mutually exclusive. We have seen this in the way that English Premier League clubs like Manchester City and Manchester United have invested billions of dollars in the development of training facilities, of communal festivities, in the upholding of the community pride, in a pursuit to make sure that, one, the community club is more successful, but also two, that the community can revel in that celebration. We think from team opposition, our strategy is simple. We have to give you ample evidence that in certain instances, private ownership is important, whereas government has to defend a blanket policy in which all clubs, across all sports, across all leagues, across all clubs, participate in fan ownership. Two burdens from our side of the house. How private ownership is significantly more likely to bring success and why that's important. And secondly, about how private ownership actively globalizes sports and brings the sport to billions of sport enthusiasts all around the world. We think what constitutes ownership is not only representation, but also capability. Thus, if we can show to you that private owners are better capable of running these clubs, then we think we have every right to allow them to do so. Yes?
Would you be okay with the national cricket team of Bangladesh being owned by a foreign corporation?
No, no, but we would be okay with certain corporations specifically sponsoring them. We'll show you in our argumentation how the incentive structures are inherently different in for national teams, etc. But before we move on to our own case, a few layers of regard. First, they claim that these are democratic public goods that are for the well-being of the community, thus the community owns them. Factually incorrect. In a large number of cases, parks and community recreation centers are owned by state-sponsored organizations. For example, the Parks Association of America. Why do we let them own these things? Because we think that they're best suited to serve the community and best suited to maintain these things. As we think that similar stake applies. If we can show to you that private owners are the best equipped, then we think this is it. They say that community has the greatest stake because it's taxpayers' money that they build their stadiums with. Factually incorrect again, because a lot of clubs and a lot of private owners invest their very own money and their very own risk in building these stadiums, building these clubs. Where Manchester City has Sheikh Mansour has invested $2 billion of his own money in the creation of the Etihad Stadium. Second, the idea that these are built on public area. No, often these are built by private owners on their own area. For example, the Club of Liverpool was built by John Holding on his own private land because he wanted a footballing club inside Anfield. They need to defend those cases as well. Third, their idea about how you formulate your identities around clubs. Sure, you formulate your identities around a lot of things as well, but you also give private entities access to those things. For example, you form your nationalistic identity around museums, around artifacts inside those museums. But these museums are owned by private entities. Why? We believe that ownership is not the end in and of itself, but it's also the upholding of that ownership and making sure that your identity is glorified. In these instances where these private owners are best suited to do that, we think that they are the ones. But finally, their argumentation about how ticket prices are excised. Look, this is simply bad business strategy on the parts of private owners themselves, because they also have to understand that if you lock fans out of the club, not only will you get stadium boycotts in which fans do not attend your games at all, do not attempt to buy your ticket prices at all, but also it means you're simply having empty seats that are a cost. But more importantly, we think that ticket prices are often set around the median income of a club. So in England, the reason ticket prices are high is because they have a greater GDP per capita to afford those tickets. So we don't think that this is an exclusive measure. Moving on to argumentation. I have two layers of argumentation in my own speech. First, how investment is crucial to the development of these clubs, and second, about how the development and success bridges the clubs to their communities. First argumentation, how private investment is crucial to the development of these clubs. There are two layers under this. First layer, how private investors are able to access vast amounts of money for the club. Two reasons why. Two reasons why. First, the diversified investments that these private owners have. Private owners usually own other businesses before they buy their sporting clubs. We've seen this in the case of Mark Cuban, a media tycoon inside America. Mark Cuban, a media tycoon inside America, owning the Dallas Mavericks after he became established. Why is this important? Because this means that these private investors have safer investments elsewhere that reduce the risk of them buying these clubs and maintaining them. Because clubs are inherently risky. You don't know what the outcome of every game will be. You don't know what the outcome of investing in a particular player will be. But also, clubs have very slim profit margins. Most of this will be reinvested to make sure that club stays competitive for the next season as well. So these are difficult investments to make unless you have safer investments elsewhere. We think communities are unlikely to have this because not only do they have their own jobs, their own families to take care of, but they're also incapable of having the know-how on how to have investments elsewhere that can back up the risk in these communities. Second, how these private investors have huge reserves and hedge funds of cash. Why is this important? This is important for huge cash injections to take place into this club. Because the development of the club is not only dependent on continuous slow investments, but also on huge cash injections that A, create massive infrastructural changes. For example, those stadiums and those training facilities that you talk about, but also the fact that these investments will never see returns until a few years into the future. This is why clubs like Manchester City often buy players at an early time and wait until 5 or 6 years before that player gets good, on which they can make that investment. We think majority of communities are unlikely to do this. Why? Two reasons. First, because they go through economic downturns, and the economic downturns affect these communities much harsher than they affect corporations. But secondly, they're also unlikely to have huge cash reserves that they can access immediately to make quick changes and quick infrastructural development. What benefits does this funding then create? Two benefits. First, infrastructure. You're able to access better training staff, better youth recruitment, better medical staff. You're able to play on AstroTurfs instead of grass. You're able to have better coaches and better managers. B, you're also likely to have better athleticism, meaning that you can add squad depth without having to sacrifice certain positions, because you can train 2 good players for every position and you can pay wages to attract and remain talent. But finally also, you're able to have emergency funds to deal with your injuries and urgently buy key players when they become available. You're able to do this not only for your main team, but also for your under 19 and under 21 teams as well. Why is this particularly important? Because the unique capacity and the incentive structure of private investors means that they're able to provide the facilities that the team needs to increase their chance of success at every point in game. We think this is crucial because fans revel in the success of the clubs, and that success is what we owe the fans in reciprocity for their emotional investment. Ladies and gentlemen, success is not only a profit scheme, but also an important tool to bind together and uplift that community. It is important to make full use of that tool. Back to oppose.
I would like to thank the first speaker of opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the second speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
San Diego had lots of Charger fans, and there was a stadium over there where the Chargers played. And they were very happy as long as the Chargers were investing money there. But then one day the Chargers decided that they simply don't want to be in this community anymore, that the corporation decided that they can earn more money somewhere else, so they uprooted the team, took them out of the community and 1,600 miles away to Los Angeles. Those fans protested outside the Chargers headquarters and threw away their memorabilia because they felt betrayed. Betrayed that a corporation could simply take away their team, take away the opportunity to enjoy those matches whatsoever. Stadium relocation is a huge trend within the NFL, and one stadium is relocated every single year at least. It happened with the Rams moving away from Los Angeles. It happened with the Baltimore Colts going to Cleveland as well. So we think that for them to not even analyze or to even refute a major part of Zoha's case at first proposition is incredibly criminal. More than that, their entire positive case relies on one premise, that we want more money in sports. So we prove to you as a proposition that that money, or all the benefits that they're talking about, simply arrive from more money, can be achieved in our world as well. We simply win this debate and they have nothing left to stand upon. How do we do this? Because we told you, well, you still have sponsorships, advertisement deals, match day revenue within our world as well. So for example, the Bundesliga, which is the league within Germany, actually gets 57% of their revenue from sponsorships and advertisement deals, compared to the Premier League, which spends 27%, which gets 27% from those. Do you know why those corporations do that? Because they can earn money through other ways. For example, through raising ticket prices and disadvantaging poor people. And that's what they don't understand. They say, well, when you boycott stadiums, there are going to be empty seats. So for example, clubs or corporations have a profit incentive to keep prices low. That's not true, because the seats aren't empty. They're just now filled with rich fans. And we're not going to discriminate over here and say some people don't have the right to enjoy a communal good simply by the virtue of their income status. But apart from that, we don't think they really did a good job of refuting our principal argument regarding how we should have ownership over public good. Their one refutation was, well, parks are owned by the state. Exactly. And the state is elected by who? We, the people. When you have parks and recreation departments hosted by the state, we think it's the same principle of community ownership, right? Because communities elect local councils, which then make decisions regarding the park. Something we also outlined within our policy as a potential way for community ownership to work out. So we don't understand why they're giving more examples which simply go with our case. But apart from that, right, they try to refute this idea of how clubs have a stake by saying, well, a lot of clubs are, built by other people and on other land. Thank you. But understand this. 28 out of 32 of the stadiums within the National Football League are paid for by fans. That's an overwhelming majority, we feel. And even when it comes to league football, like in England, when it comes to private corporations, for example, investing a lot, they still haven't given you a principal justification for why corporations have the right to invest. We think all they're saying is that, well, their investment leads to some kind of benefits. If we're proving those benefits to you and have our own principled deontological stance within this debate, we feel like we're clearly the better side. But apart from that, when it comes to our argument regarding instrumentalizing and commodifying a cultural identity, their one refutation is, well, museums are owned by private corporations as well. Firstly, we think when it comes to a lot of your artifacts, that's not really true. You have public museums across the world, and we think your local artifacts should not be owned by private corporations. Someone shouldn't be able to decorate their walls with your very culture simply by the virtue of the fact that they had the money to do it. We don't think that's okay, and they need to come here and tell us why it's okay to snatch someone's culture and sell it for a profit to earn more bucks. We don't think they've done that. When it comes to ticket pricing, I've already refuted that, but on another level, when they say things like, well, community clubs might face economic downturns, they don't have the money to invest. We think they're very confused as a side, because it's not like every day I'm going to pay $10 to invest into that club as a community. That's not how it works. We feel like any kind of football club earns revenue from, for example, matchday revenue, from TV advertisements and deals, sponsorships. We think all of those factors still exist. but we have an extra benefit that all money is reinvested back into the club, right? Because in your world, corporations get a slice of the cake, they take money out of the club as well. The same way the Glazers take $1 billion out of Manchester United in the last 10 years, and we don't think that's okay. Yes, sir?
You claim that ticket prices will remain low, but then you say that these ticket prices are often the only source of income for these fans. How are these two
I literally
exist?
just stated like 3 other sources of revenue. We don't think they're the only source. We've clearly shown how Bundesliga in Germany has other sources of revenue, and that's how they earn their money. So we really don't think these arguments of theirs stand within this debate. We don't think they've refuted our principle. All our practical benefits will stand. Let me give you 2 more. Firstly, we think that community clubs actually better drive the engines of social change within society. How do they do that? We think that when it comes to corporations, they actively limit the political expression of players, and that's what you saw in the NFL, where there are 32 white owners, and whereas most of the players playing are actually from the African American community. So when players like Colin Kaepernick took a knee to the national anthem because he wanted to protest the slaughter of African Americans within his country, they kicked him out of the club. And just in April, the NFL passed a policy saying that anyone who takes a knee or conducts any kind of political expression will be simply removed from the game. That's because these white owners don't really necessarily connect with those players, and those players stand for issues that their fans find important. On contrast, we think community clubs actually represent those values of fans and lead to a more diverse and a more socially progressive society. That's what you see in the case of Barcelona, where the club FC Barcelona actually stands for Catalonia's right and right to independence, where they actually wear armbands and they raise slogans of democracy within their stadiums, where there are no other alternatives for those people. So we bring social change better within our world. Now let's talk to you about how community clubs cultivate local talent better and in turn improve the national team. We think that when it comes to community clubs, they have a greater incentive than corporations to actually get local players. Because understand that in their world, when it comes to the English Premier League, they don't really focus on local talent. 90% of funding for these clubs goes in international transfers, not in building local players from the ground up, because for them it's just about earning short-term profits. And it plays a huge deal when it comes to what the local players are actually like within the team. Because when it comes to, for example, FC Barcelona, which is a community-owned club, they invest in their youth squad and they actually allow it to play within the second league division and actually invest a lot in it to a level where that youth squad wins the youth under-21 championship every year in the European continent. In contrast, the English under-21 squad is heavily neglected by these corporate clubs simply because that many people don't view the under-21 championships. There's not that much profit to be gained from it, and they can simply pick up an international player from Brazil anytime they want. Why even care about the local community? I'll tell you why you should care about the local community. We think you should care about them because just by the accident of birth, that they were born in a certain community, that doesn't mean they don't have the right to self-actualize, to fulfill their dreams. And that's what we're doing for you today on Side Proposition. We think we're better fulfilling the dreams of the community. We think they are crashing them. Please vote Proposition.
I would like to thank the second speaker of the proposition for their speech and would like to invite the second speaker of opposition to deliver their speech.
The entire case sounds like rich people are just biased towards themselves, care about profiting, and somehow don't care about the people. But the fact is that these people need these communal people to come in to watch their games, to buy their jerseys. They want these people to come in, watch their games on TVs, etc. And for all of them, they need to care to the community because the vast majority of TV deals and etc. come from within these communities. Sales of jerseys happen within these communities more than anywhere else. If these incentives do apply to these rich investors, we think they act in a way that caters to these communal people more than anyone else. What did we hear from that side? We heard, first of all, that public goods like museums are meant to cater to the people, and sports teams similarly bring people together. So therefore, we need to outsource their ownership towards the people. The problem is that the value of uniting people does not oblige us to hand over ownership. Because how do these clubs necessarily unite these people? Is it simply because the clubs are just there? Is it simply because the stadiums are located there? No. We think if that was true, then clubs like FC United of Manchester that perform really poorly would have united people as well. What exactly unites people is the performance, is their success, which makes people feel that their communal identity is being venerated, that they are being established as a community within their country. And that is exactly what we are trying to achieve. So if uniting people is a public good, we are suiting to that better because we are allowing people who can better represent these communities, better glorify these communities to own these clubs in the first place. But secondly, if that argumentation is true, we think in your world, some people do feel left out. Why is that so? Because there are many people who aren't just rich enough to be able to financially contribute. There are, for example, during downfalls, economic downfalls, there are some people who probably cannot afford to, financially contribute to these clubs. These are people who feel left out because while people down the street on the other side of the house can afford to, put in finance into these clubs, they cannot simply because they were arbitrarily born poor. If uniting people, allowing people to identify with these clubs is a common good that you want to aim for, within your side of the house, that happens as well. So I don't see why communal ownership necessarily solves every single one of these problems that you are asking us to solve. Secondly, they tell you that clubs express the community's identity. We think, first of all, naming the club after the community does not necessarily oblige us to hand over the ownership, because many of these clubs venerate that community as well. That is to say, every single time that club succeeds, for instance, every single time Liverpool succeeds, it's about Scousers' pride. It's about how Scousers have won over any other community in that club, in that country. But secondly, if the communal identity is so strongly linked, we think in your side of the house, there are a lot of cases in which that communal identity gets threatened. That is to say, every single time that team gets relegated, or say, every single time that team loses against the club of another community, their identity is being dragged down. They feel inferior. So for all of those argument stations to stand, you have to prove to me why success happens on your side of the house. How did they try to prove that? They told us that we have sponsorships, TV deals, and etc. to cover up the finance. The problem is the sponsorships first of all, exists on both sides of the house, so it doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily mutually exclusive to your side. But we'll tell you why it decreases on your side. First of all, it's because promotion campaigns are about outreach. When community-owned clubs promote a communal identity, operate mostly within these communities, these sponsors know that they will probably not get much outreach when they invest in these clubs, which is to say, these sponsorships will probably decrease on your side. But secondly, if these communities are so community-centric and want these clubs to focus on the community so much, they probably wouldn't want sponsorships from other communities, from external bodies. That is, that would be seen upon as encroaching on their own communal property. If these clubs are so communal-centric, these are the ways in which you probably reject sponsorships in the vast majority of cases. But lastly, we think that sponsors wouldn't want to go to clubs from poorer communities as well, because they know that for them, because they cannot make an impact in the decision making, they have to make a safe investment in clubs that are already renowned, in clubs that are already succeeding, not in poorer communities. Why does that get solved in our side of the house? Because private investors know they can contribute in the decision making. What they do is they go into these poor communities, make these clubs greater, and globalize them, market them abroad, even within these communities, to get more sales, to promote, to get money out of them. Then they tell you, yes.
What's the difference between a national and a local identity? You're still supposed to make that distinction. You haven't done so far.
First of all, national team is one that represents every single one of these communities. I don't see why a private investor, once they get into these national teams, would have an obligation to cater to all these communities. Because in that sort of a world, we think the state is much better capable of doing that. But the problem is that you have conceded that the national team shouldn't be selected by a group, by the people through a national referendum. If that is true, you're conceding that at some point in time, we think functionality needs to be weighed over the communal identity being represented. What are my points of argumentation? I'll be proving to you why private ownership globalizes sports and brings it to billions of sports enthusiasts beyond their borders. Why is that so? Because community-owned clubs don't usually promote themselves abroad. Why? If government's characterization is true, these owners are very community-centric. They care more about the community fans and communal identity. They have less incentive to cater to international fans or the international fan base. We think, secondly, it's difficult to convince shareholders who happen to be people from within these communities to invest abroad or remote places like favelas in Brazil or, for instance, by taking a massive cut from the investment within their communities. This concludes that in their side of the house, globalization is decreased. These community-owned clubs wouldn't promote themselves abroad. Private investors, however, don't differentiate between fans as long as they can earn profits. That is to say, in our world, a few things happen. One, the identity of the sporting club is globalized. That is the reason why Manchester United is not just about Manchester anymore. It's about Red Devils, a global identity, an identity that most people can identify with. But secondly, we have promotions of these clubs abroad through TV deals, through sales of merchandises, widespread sales of merchandises abroad. Lastly, we have academy programs, worldwide recruitment programs, such as Manchester United's recruitment program from every countries like Bangladesh, where they recruited 200 players from each and every country. These provide massive benefits to the international community. One, in countries where certain sports aren't popular, globalization allows people there to access these forms of sports by TV deals, by buying jerseys, and etc. It broadens the spectrum of choices available for these people. In your world, these sorts of choices are confined to only sports available within their country, which might not be popular enough, which might not be qualified enough. But secondly, we have expanded academy programs, which means young people within countries like Bangladesh, within countries like Malaysia, where football is probably not that great, where the state does not provide them with enough facilities, can now dream of becoming a footballer because of those expanded academy programs. This dream is one that we stand for, and we wouldn't want to take it away. Secondly, it is wrong to say that the success and connection with the club must be constrained within that community, the boundaries of which is morally arbitrary. In our world, more fans across the globe, regardless of the geographics, can enjoy the success. In your world, it is only available for people who are morally arbitrarily born within their communities. But secondly, we think a person living in Philippines now can enjoy sports and find a momentary relapse from the corruption and oppression of their country's governance. These are the ways in which people find relapse in the sporting success. That is what you don't give to these people. In conclusion, if team government wants to cater to the emotions of the community, we expand that community and cater to a greater number of people. So on a utilitarian scale, we surely win that. But on a principle scale as well, we don't necessarily see why their principles oblige us to hand over ownership over these people, or to these people. We think that obliges us to make this club successful so that they venerate these communities better, and that's exactly what we're doing. We are very proud of those.
I would like to thank the second speaker of opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the third speaker of the proposition to deliver their speech.
Opposition's entire case rests on one assumption, that if you have corporate ownership, the club will necessarily succeed, ladies and gentlemen. Which means that they have now taken on this burden themselves, and now they have to absolutely prove to us that corporate ownership means guaranteed success. And we don't think that's true because they're ignoring a huge, in fact, the vast majority of clubs in the world, which are small clubs, ladies and gentlemen. Clubs like Blackpool, clubs like Charlton Athletica, ladies and gentlemen, whose owners haven't been to their games in 2 years, who have been relegated to lower divisions every subsequent year, ladies and gentlemen. These are clubs that are corporate owned, but do not get any success. These are clubs who are corporate owned, but whose players have been promised bonuses for years, but still haven't gotten those bonuses till today, ladies and gentlemen. They're ignoring a huge chunk of this debate, and we think that's criminal. But secondly, if they believe that corporate ownership has so many benefits and so many unique benefits that community ownership does not, then we think that then they should, by that logic, also be telling us that all all clubs should be corporate owned rather than letting both models exist in the world. So now their burden is also to prove to us that every single club in the world should be corporate owned, and we think that is something that they absolutely have not done in this debate so far, right? But thirdly, they're assuming that there is no success for community owned clubs. Some of the biggest clubs in the world are community owned. FC Barcelona, case in point, ladies and gentlemen. Real Madrid, case in point. We've talked to you about this time and time again, but opposition has not once engaged with any of this analysis and have failed in their basic burden today. But before I move on to my own issues, right, let's talk about all the other things that they haven't talked about. Because we had three big ideas, especially Sarim's second speaker case, which they did not even bother acknowledging exists in this debate. We talked to you about how stadiums get relocated in Zoha's speech and how that limits access of fans and hurts the community, never once engaged. Secondly, Sarim talked to you about how these clubs are an important vehicle for social change, never once engaged. We think that's a huge impact, especially in smaller local communities that don't have independent voices of their own otherwise, right, and need these clubs. But thirdly, we talked to you about how this cultivates local talent, ladies and gentlemen, why that's so important and how that improves the game as a whole. Never once tackled by team opposition. Third opposition is too late to do that, so we've clearly won on these arguments alone. But let's move on to the two issues in this debate. First of all, does the community have a right to own a communal activity in a communal club? We think absolutely yes. Secondly, in what world is the sport better off? And we think that's very obviously proposition's world. Let's prove these both issues to you. First of all, the right to own. And over here, they simply had two premises. Firstly, they told us that individuals and corporations have invested in these clubs, so then by that extension, they have a right to own and control these clubs. Secondly, they told us that success unites people and corporations will necessarily allow success to happen, which means that the community will be better off. The second premise is actually hung on all their practical ideas, so we'll deal with it later, but let's deal with the first idea of right to ownership just because you've invested in something, right? Firstly, we think that in order for the right to ownership or right to entrepreneurship to exist in this case, we think they need to prove to us that this club is private property and can thus function like any other private property in society or private business in society. But we think that this analysis completely ignores every single thing that Zoha talked to you about in first, where we told you that this is not private property in the first place. It is a democratic good, it is a public utility, right? So your private rights cannot apply to a public utility. But secondly, we think that they themselves conceded to this when they said that the national team of Bangladesh should not be owned by corporations, ladies and gentlemen. So if the national team has some kind of national value, why doesn't a communal team have communal value, ladies and gentlemen? That's something that they have not cleared up for us. It is literally just a difference in the scale of geography over here, and that's something that it's their burden to prove now. But the second refutation to this, we think that even if a private right exists in this case, we never once said that we're taking it away completely. Our principles, if you haven't heard, are majority ownership, which means that even in our world, private individuals are still and corporations are still allowed to invest in these organizations, right? They said that these organizations won't want to invest any longer because they don't have control. Okay, we told you that that doesn't really matter because you have alternate sources of revenue. But secondly, if these corporations and individuals are so good-hearted and care so much about the clubs, they'll invest anyway, regardless of whether or not they're getting a profit, right? But the third refutation to this, right? And why is limiting this right justified? We think that over here they need to understand that the government limits the rights of corporations in many, many scenarios all the time, right? We think that this is done on the basis of a harm principle. A greater harm exists, which is why you limit this right. We think that this is done every time you nationalize any kind of business or organization, because you realize that regardless of investment, regardless of profit, regardless of individual risk, ladies and gentlemen, some things are just too important to be privatized. And all of this they haven't refuted. What did we say to you within this issue? We told you that there's a stake, which is why, like the national vote, you have a stake in the country, so you get a national vote. You have a stake in this communal club, so you should get a vote in this too. This is why this right exists, and this is something that we never refuted. So this issue we have clearly taken. Before I move on to my second one, short.
You limit corporate ownership based on harm. In a world where corporate ownership turns up benefiting these clubs, why does the same principle apply?
Because of all our principal arguments that aren't based on practical endpoints that I just talked about for 4 minutes. Let's move on on to the second issue, ladies and gentlemen. And over here they had three premises. Firstly, they talked about how private profit motive, intersects with the community's desire of success, right? And that's why their interests align. First of all, we think that they never once proved to us why money equals success. We don't think it does. We think in a lot of cases, regardless of whether you have money or not, if you don't have the proper management, then it does not equal success. To have the proper management, you must have the interests of the club and the community at heart, something that we have in our work. But secondly, we think that they shot themselves in the foot when they brought up this argument. Because at first speaker, their analysis was that these clubs are risky investments, they get marginal profits, so a corporation that has a profit incentive is not going to reinvest these profits back into the club, especially when they're marginal profits and they want to grab what they can while they still can, right? So there's no reinvestment over here and the interests aren't aligned. But their second speaker said, oh, we're going to make, their second speaker actually had a completely different conception of this, where he said, oh, we're going to make, corporations want to make safe investments instead. So if a corporation wants to make a safe investment, why would they invest in a poorer community where the people won't have the money to buy these tickets or access the game, right? They said that there's always an incentive to have people watch the game, but that's not true. They want rich people to watch the game, ladies and gentlemen, which is why they raise ticket prices, and that is never refuted. But third, their second premise over here, that communities go through economic downturns, which is why they can't pay for this. Firstly, we told you there's other forms of revenue never once engaged with. For example, Portsmouth, when they didn't have a community revenue of its own, it arranged a fundraiser which was good enough to buy the club, right? But secondly, we told you that economic downturns don't work in a way where every single person in the community suddenly goes bankrupt and can't afford bread and water. There's still rich people and middle class people that exist in the community and can buy all of that stuff. Their last argument about globalization of sports assumes that communities don't want sports to be globalized, but communal identity matters to them so much that they have an active incentive to globalize that sport so they can promote their own identity. We've clearly taken this debate because they haven't refuted half our case and the other half still clearly stands, ladies and gentlemen. Vote Team Pakistan.
I would like to thank the third speaker of the proposition for their speech, and would like to invite the third speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
The reason why we didn't need to spend a lot of time refuting the fact that stadiums are taken out of certain places is because it was just based on an example that is one-off. Because we think back in the day, when Everton Stadium was taken out of Anfield, it is only then John Holding came up and made Liverpool FC. So if you have one example backing that argument, we have one example backing argument which says that sometimes, if not all, private entities can work for the benefit. Now, it's an important thing to visualize at this point, is that they need to tell us why, in all cases, even when private entities do good for communities, even then you snatch away that private entity's right to own these clubs. Whereas, we just need to prove to you, in certain cases, private entities are good because we aren't banning community ownership. So in cases where you have rich places like Barcelona, please have community ownership. But we're telling you in cases, in other cases, right? So three things I'll be talking to you in this speech. First, under which world do you have more representation? Second, under which world do you have better financial capacity? And lastly, under which world do you help the poor people? First, on representation. Two things that they said. First, it's a democratic public good. There's two things you need to note here, right? First, note that the reason why you cannot classify that as that, because one, private companies pay tax on the land they own, pay tax on the revenue, which means they have a redistributive mechanism that you give back to the people, right? Secondly, we think they offer corporate social responsibility where they do charities and things of that sort, where they're mandated by the government to essentially do that, so we think they do a lot for the community. Lastly, they didn't tell us why they don't want to ban privately owned museums, right? Because in certain cases, it is the government that gives away ownership of artifacts to private entities because they can take care of them better, which essentially asks us to believe that it is important that you are capable of owning rather than just not representation. But secondly, and this is quite crucial, and because this is the entire premise of their case, that cultural representation needs to happen, right? So one, we told you that there will be cultural representation because, as they clearly point out, these companies have a vested interest to make sure your community's identity is upheld so that they can make a profit. The only time that is wrong is if they plunder with that identity. Given that they make that identity global and relatable to everyone, means that they're doing a net benefit to your identity and not a net loss. Second, all their argumentation is just telling us why people need a voice. In a world where you can tell you that people have a voice under our world, we think we clearly win. So why do people have a voice? Because number one, companies do surveys where they essentially ask the people what they want and accordingly tailor their products to it. Secondly, we don't know why just because you select a representative body, they'll listen to you all the time. Because governments clearly don't always listen to you. We don't think your mechanism translates to people getting what they want all the time, which essentially makes us believe something very simple, that the mechanism of representation can possibly be flawed. Why are you banking on it on your principle? We don't know. But there are three things to note at the end that gives us this debate. First, we think under their world there's actually less representation. Because why? Manchester now must have one club. Because you can't have City and United both. Why? Because the amount of money people of Manchester have is not humongous. Which means under their world, fans are forced to follow one club, whereas under a world where private entities own different City and United, we think you can have affiliations everywhere. So if your identity relates to City more than United, you can go for City. Second, we think under their world, other sports don't get investment, right? And this is important because people would always want to follow the sport that has the most traction. So we think that sports that are niche in nature, that only private companies want to make big, wouldn't exist under their world because it will be left on the whims of people as to whether they like the sport or not. Under our world, we have an example of the Kabaddi League sponsored by Honda in India, which essentially was made big by a private entity who wanted to make profit. And lastly, and this is the biggest reason why we win this clash, because we talk to you about a global representation, ladies and gentlemen, where we tell you that communities don't have an incentive to do it. And this is incentive structure, right? So they cannot, say that it didn't exist. Because one, the fact that you want to own a club means that you just want to limit it to your community. Why would you want someone else to dilute your identity if you want to just have it in Manchester? But secondly, no thank you, in order to have more people, you need to have mass scale promotions. Given that all of your attention is limited to your community, what chance you will have to expand it to everyone, we don't essentially know. Given that we give solace to everyone all around the world, given that I, sitting in Bangladesh, can relate to Red Devils, means that private entities have given me that Manchester identity, something that cannot happen under their world, right? Moving on to my second clash about why it helps poor people. Before that, sure.
In Bangladesh, do you have fans who support Real Madrid and FC Barcelona, or is it just corporate clubs?
Again, these are very rich clubs, and we have that under their world. You're taking away United, right? You need to defend that. We need not defend those anomalies, right? So how does it help poor people? And this is quite important. Have they ever thought about what happens to the demographies that are obviously poor? Because if you remember correctly, not all places have the same amount of money, which means that the amount of funding in a place like Manchester would be significantly more than the amount of money in some other rural parts of London. Why is these areas more protected under our world, right? And this is crucial. Because companies have a vested interest to go to poorer communities and sell their products there. So the fact of the matter is, given that they'll invest to increase brand value, they're likely to go and invest in these poor areas. Under your world, these poor areas are gonna dig a hole in their pocket to find some money, or else their team won't perform well. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that ticket prices won't be high under our world. Why? Because basic demand and supply. If you have seats that need to be filled up, you cannot just charge drastically high prices. Their example of Bundesliga and EPL was a lie, right? Because note that EPL gives you varying prices for varying seats, which means
sir.
that it doesn't just cater to the rich, means that it does cater to the poor in the vast majority of cases. It is Bundesliga that often sets price caps that often don't adapt to the varying nature of recessionary periods. So why do we help poor people under our world? And this is quite crucial. Because companies have an interest to not distinguish between rich and poor, because they want to appeal to the maximum amount of people. In your world, rich people would be able to buy shares, and rich people would be the one to get the most shots. We think under our world, poor people are a market segment, and you will have to appeal to the poor people. Lastly, financial capacity. And I really don't need to spend much time here. I'll tell you why. Because if the maximum reputation under their world is this, that sponsors will exist or there are factors that exist under their world, we need to just tell you it's more under ours. Why is it the case? Because we have things like hedge funds, etc., which is useful in cases of emergency transfers, it is useful in cases of recessionary periods that don't help your world. Which means on a comparative, if you look at financial capacity, which side will be better? A side which essentially has the ability to take loans, a side that has the ability to generate maximum revenue. Compare that to a side that is reliant upon the people to spend money out of their own pockets that they must not always have. Sheerly on the basis of why finance leads to better success, we impose that success as the pride of that country, pride of that nation, and that is why we support.
I would like to thank the third speaker of the opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the reply speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
3 issues. 1, in which world do these communities get catered to by the ones that own the club? 2, which clubs are more likely to succeed? And 3, based on that principle, whether or not simply because you represent people, should that be a basis for the people owning those clubs? First of all, on the basis of which, in the issue of in which world do these communities get catered to? They said that in certain instances we've seen high ticket prices, we've seen stadium relocations and etc. Never do they ever, tell you why. There's an incentive for that happening in the first place. They give us miscellaneous examples without any analysis about why that incentive exists. We told you why that incentive does not exist. We told you why it goes against those profiteering incentives. That is to say, catering to a few rich people would not cover up the entire cost, nor would that allow you to profit here. That is to say, if you make up a price that is affordable for the majority, your stadium seats get booked, your jerseys get sold, people buy your TV deals, and etc. These are the ways in which you get to reach out to a greater number of people and make more profits. Never do they ever respond to all of that. But then we told you from our first speaker why there's significant backlash every single time you do so. We see stadium boycotts. We see people not going out and buying jerseys. These are the ways in which people go out, protest against all these sorts of things. We have also given you the example of the ways in which the ways in which people protested when Hull City owners wanted to name their club Hull Tigers. That is the way in which people protest and bring these clubs to a position that they cater to these communities. But then we told you why these communities have an incentive to cater to the people on our side. That is to say, the more you build the connection between the people and the club, the more you get sales on tickets, the more you get sales on jerseys, and etc. So if these private investors are so greedy on profits, they have an incentive to make people feel that they should go out and buy tickets, buy jerseys, and the way to do so is to make these people feel a part of this club. Above all of this, we told you about globalization. What did they tell you? They questioned why communities won't have the incentive to do so. We told you why these communities' own clubs will be community-centric. But even in your best-case scenario, if they do have the incentive, what do? They globalize a communal identity that most people around the world will not be able to identify with. So the globalization argument at least doesn't have the same scale of impact that it has on our side of the house. Lastly, they told you about the identity and the representation of that. The problem is that the purpose of the club is to not provide an identity that was otherwise non-existent. The purpose of the club is to glorify and venerate a pre-existent identity. So if we can prove to you why these clubs represent these communities better, we surely win that clash as well. How do we do so? We told you why private investors' investment is needed. That is a massive cash injection that needs to change over time. Every single time your players get into it, you need to cover that up by buying another player, and that requires massive cash injection. Against all of these, they said, we have sponsorships, we have TV deals. If that was really true, every single club would have had the same, same financing, simply because they have sponsorships and TV deals, as if the private investment has no additional value. The problem is that we told you why sponsorships wouldn't come, because these are community-centric, because there is not much outreach in these communities. We have heard no response to all of this. Lastly, they told you why the principle matters. These are local goods, these are public goods, and they need to be owned by people. The problem is that although they represent these communities, we think it's not just representational value, it's about veneration. We say that it's about glorifying the community that matters most. And every single time your team gets relegated, every single time your team does not get to be in the top 10, your identity gets dragged down. If that identity has such immense value that needs to be represented, we think glorification through success is what is needed. If we can, and therefore, as we have proven to you why success happens more on our side of the house, we surely win that clash as well. Because simply pointing to these clubs as local public goods with emotional sway does not necessarily prove your principle. We are very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the reply speaker of the opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the reply speaker of the proposition to deliver their speech.
The same way, it was too late for third opposition to bring in most of their positive case and start questioning us on our policy. We think it's going to be too late by the time that fans finally realize that they're being locked out of their stadiums the same way they were in 1960 when NFL passed their law. We think that we're saving those fans within our world, and we need to understand this. Because you need to understand that simply saying, well, you have examples in your lines of arguments isn't a justification for not even refuting those lines of arguments. And when Visha clearly says that we have 3 lines of arguments unrefuted, number 1 about stadium relocation, number 2 about your social change what is brought about, and number 3 about local players being promoted, simply saying, well, you know, the stadium relocation thing was just one example. Incorrect, it was 5. When it comes to the other 2, they don't even mention them. So they don't even care about local players and their dreams. They don't even care about the African civil rights movement in America, or about the passion that people feel for Catalonia. So they need to give us reasons for why those people don't even deserve a mention from their side within this debate. They haven't done that. But apart from that, they're very principally inconsistent when they say the Bangladesh cricket team shouldn't be owned by a private corporation. Why? Don't the same reasons apply that perhaps maybe Bangladesh isn't the largest economy in the world and isn't able to earn as much? The same way corporations go to poorer communities, corporation would also be able to go to Bangladesh cricket team, buy that out, and of course, because you inherently assume that corporations make every single club better, they should make Bangladesh cricket team better as well. So that's where they don't even believe in what they're saying on their side. But apart from that, let's get to the issues. Number 1, do local communities deserve a say in local sports, or do corporations have the right to snatch it away? At proposition, we ran 2 principles. Number 1, that it's a public good. They said, well, museums are sometimes private goods. We told you, no, they're not. No response from their side after that on our principle. Then our principle was once again challenged by saying, well, there's a law apparently now which says that all corporations have to make charities as well. Untrue, and that doesn't take down our principal argument. Zoha spent 3 minutes on this. They could have done better than 2 lines and consistently argue. But secondly, when it comes to cultural appropriation, simply saying that, well, if they don't distort your cultural identity, it's fine, is not a good enough refutation in third opposition, because we think the fact that you're profiting off that culture, profiting off that name, whereas the local community could have been earning from that, is morally abhorrent and disgusting to begin with. But apart from that, right, when it comes to opposition's premises, it's literally, and they said something very interesting in reply in third op. People should protest and convince companies to change their policies. So you're saying people say matters. So if people say comes from a more direct way within our world, we're achieving that very end goal way better than you. But apart from that, they give no principled reason for why corporations should have a right. So even if all teams aren't successful within our world, we still think we're better off than they are. Because understand, this debate isn't about in which world teams will be more successful, because they're bad community teams and they're good community teams, the same way they're bad clubs which are owned by corporations and they're good clubs owned by corporations which are established this. When it comes to the second issue of in which world is sports better, when it comes to ticket prices, the simple logic we were running is that corporations can't make a profit when ticket prices are low, so they're likely to raise them, and the fact that rich fans can fill in those seats better is something they did not really refute. But apart from that, when it comes to poorer community, when it comes to this idea of globalization, it's really weird because they're like, well, clubs like Barcelona and Real Madrid apparently don't have a global fan base, which is very untrue. But from that, what we're trying to show to you is that local community-owned clubs also have an incentive to advertise globally and to get fans globally. And it's not like we're stopping, it's not like you as a Manchester United fan will suddenly stop supporting the fan now that it's stop supporting the club, now that it's community-based. We don't understand, and if you do that, they're just a really bad fan. But apart from that, we also believe that at the end of the day, in our world, all of our two principal arguments stand, and the fact that they don't refute most of our case, but the parts that they do refute are very inconsistent and very late for the sake of every single entity in sports. Vote Team Pakistan.
I would like to thank all the speakers for the debate. Please leave the classroom so that the adjudicators can make their decision.